Have you ever been invisible? I mean truly invisible. Standing in a room full of people who look right through you like you're not even there? That's what it feels like to be staff at a Manhattan gala. Nobody sees your face. Nobody remembers your name. You're just a uniform carrying champagne, part of the scenery, completely and utterly forgettable. Which is exactly why I chose to sneak into my husband's exclusive spouses not invited charity event disguised as a server. The truth? I had my suspicions. 3 months of late nights, unexplained expenses, a husband who suddenly couldn't look me in the eye. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I saw when he walked through those ballroom doors. He wasn't alone. The woman on his arm was young, beautiful, and pregnant. And based on the way every CEO, senator, and power player in that room congratulated them like it was completely normal, they'd all known about his secret life for months. I couldn't believe it. Actually, that's a lie. I could believe it. What I couldn't believe was what I did next. See, most people would have confronted him right there, made a scene, let emotion drive the moment. But I'm not most people. I walked out of that hotel, went home, and systematically dismantled every single piece of the life he thought he'd so cleverly built behind my back. What happened next wasn't just revenge. It was justice served so cold, it came with a side of federal prison time. This is the story of how I caught my husband cheating at a gala, exposed his lies, took everything he owned, and watched karma deliver a sentence better than anything I could have planned. And trust me when I say, the devil really is in the details. The black uniform felt tighter than I expected, like it was suffocating the last bit of hope I had that maybe, just maybe, I was wrong about everything. I stood in the staff locker room of the Waldorf Grand Hotel, adjusting the name tag that said Sophia, and checking my reflection one last time. Funny, it was a name I'd always loved. Years later, I would give that name to my daughter. My hands were shaking as I clipped the fake security badge to my collar, the one my college friend Marcus had made for me after I'd broken down and told him about my suspicions. I couldn't believe I was actually doing this, sneaking into my own husband's exclusive charity gala, disguised as catering staff because he'd told me spouses weren't invited this year. The betrayal of that lie alone should have been enough. But I needed to see the truth with my own eyes. Marcus had warned me that sometimes knowing is worse than wondering, but I was past the point of backing out. For 3 months, I'd watched David come home later and later, smelling like expensive perfume that wasn't mine, his phone always face down on the table. He'd been working on the Harrison account so much that I'd started to think Harrison was code for something, or someone else. When he mentioned this gala, this men-only business event that was supposedly crucial for securing major investors, something in his voice felt off. So I did what any woman watching her marriage crumble would do. I called in favors, got myself a uniform, and decided to become invisible in a room full of Manhattan's elite. Legally, I was Catherine Chen, but at work and in my life, I always used Morrison. I wanted to be loved for me, not by a name. I'd kept my maiden name out of his world, kept it off the parts of our life that came with status and leverage. The shocking thing about being staff at these events? You literally disappear. I'd been to galas before, on David's arm, wearing designer gowns, making small talk with CEOs and their perfectly polished wives. But in this black polyester uniform with my hair pulled back and minimal makeup, I was a ghost. As I walked through the service entrance carrying a tray of champagne flutes, not a single person looked at my face. They looked through me, past me, around me. The humiliation of it stung in a way I hadn't expected, but it also gave me the perfect cover. I was about to witness my husband's secret life, and he would never know I was there. The ballroom was stunning. Crystal chandeliers, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, tables draped in cream silk with centerpieces that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. I positioned myself near the bar, refilling glasses and keeping my head down while my eyes scanned every face in the crowd. Senators, tech moguls, old money families whose names were on museum wings. This wasn't just a business event. This was a display of power, and David had told me I didn't belong here. The self-worth I'd been clinging to started to crack as I realized he'd deliberately excluded me from his world, and I was about to find out why. Then I saw him. David walked through the main entrance in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo, the one I'd helped him pick out last month. And he wasn't alone. On his arm was a woman I'd never seen before, mid-20s, stunning in an emerald gown that probably cost what I made in 6 months at the nonprofit where I worked. I worked at a nonprofit by choice, because I'd always had a network and resources that I kept private, even from my husband. She was laughing at something he said, her hand resting comfortably on his chest in that familiar way that made my blood run cold. This wasn't a business colleague. This wasn't a casual +1. The way he touched the small of her back, the way he leaned in to whisper in her ear, the way every person in that room seemed completely unsurprised to see them together. This was his real life, and I'd just been erased from it. I steadied myself against the bar, forcing my breathing to stay calm even though my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. A senior executive I recognized from David's office walked past and nodded at them with a knowing smile, like this was normal, like this was expected. The karma I'd been hoping for, that maybe I was paranoid, maybe I was wrong, evaporated in that moment. I wasn't crazy. I was being cheated on, lied to, and humiliated in front of people who'd probably known about this for months. But instead of falling apart right there in the middle of the ballroom, something else happened. Something cold and sharp settled into my chest, and I realized that if David wanted to play games with my dignity, I was about to show him what real power looked like. I watched them move through the crowd like royalty. And the worst part was how natural it all looked. David introduced her to everyone, not as a colleague or a friend, but with this possessive pride that I recognized because it used to be reserved for me. "This is Vanessa," he'd say. And the way he said her name had this warmth, this intimacy that made my stomach turn. I would only learn her full name later. Vanessa Whitmore. A tech CEO whose wedding I'd attended just last year shook her hand and said something that made them both laugh. A woman I'd had coffee with at a museum fundraiser kissed Vanessa on both cheeks like they were old friends. The family betrayal wasn't just David's. It was everyone's. They all knew. They'd all chosen to keep his secret. I moved closer, refilling water glasses at a nearby table, my hands steady even though everything inside me was screaming. Vanessa declined a champagne flute from another server with a soft smile, her hand instinctively moving to rest on her stomach, in that gesture that every woman recognizes. My breath caught in my throat. She wasn't just his mistress. She was pregnant. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. But the truth was right there in the protective way David's hand moved to her lower back, in the knowing looks from the couples around them, in the careful way she avoided anything alcoholic. This wasn't a new affair. This was a whole other life he'd built while I was at home planning our 10th anniversary trip. A silver-haired man in his 60s approached them, someone I recognized as the chairman of David's investment firm. He clapped David on the shoulder with genuine affection and said something I had to strain to hear over the string quartet. "Taking good care of our rising star, I see," he said, looking at Vanessa with approval. David's response made my blood freeze. "Only the best for her, Charles. You know that. The casual intimacy of it, the public acknowledgement, the complete lack of shame. This wasn't hidden. This was celebrated. I was the secret, the inconvenient truth he'd left at home while he paraded his real future around Manhattan's elite. They moved to their table, front and center, naturally, and I noticed how the seating arrangement told its own story. Vanessa was positioned as his partner, not just at dinner, but in every interaction. When a senator's wife asked about wedding plans, I saw Vanessa's cheeks flush, and David squeeze her hand reassuringly. When a business associate made a joke about finally settling down with the right woman, nobody corrected him. The shocking realization hit me. These people didn't know about me. Or worse, they did know, and they'd decided I didn't matter. I was the old model being traded in, and everyone was politely pretending the transaction was already complete. I stood near the kitchen doors, partially hidden behind an elaborate ice sculpture, and watched the woman wearing my husband laugh at jokes told by people I'd considered friends. She fit perfectly into this world in a way I never had. Younger, more polished, clearly from money based on the way she carried herself. David had always made me feel like my middle-class background was charming, something that made me real and grounded. But watching him with Vanessa, I understood the truth. I'd been temporary. A practice round. Someone to build his career with until he was successful enough to upgrade to the kind of woman who belonged in rooms like this. The humiliation of that realization should have broken me. But instead, it sharpened something inside me. Then came the moment that changed everything. As dessert was being served, one of the executives stood up with his wine glass and called for attention. "I want to propose a toast," he announced, his voice carrying across the ballroom. "To David and Vanessa, may your future together be as bright as the investments you're about to close." The room erupted in applause and raised glasses. David stood, pulled Vanessa up beside him, and kissed her. Not a polite peck, a real kiss, the kind that declared ownership and future and permanence. And as I watched my husband kiss his pregnant mistress in front of 300 people who thought it was beautiful, I felt the last piece of my old life shatter. But underneath the pain was something stronger. Rage. Cold, calculating rage that knew exactly what it was going to do next. I couldn't stay in that ballroom another second. The applause was still echoing. People were still congratulating them. And I felt like the walls were closing in. I set down my tray on a service table and walked as calmly as I could toward the hallway, my legs somehow carrying me, even though my entire world had just imploded. Once I was alone in the marble corridor, away from the string quartet and the clinking glasses and the sound of my husband building a future that erased me, I leaned against the wall and let myself feel it. The betrayal. The lies. The sheer audacity of him parading his pregnant mistress in front of people who were supposed to be our friends while I was at home like an idiot, believing his stories about work trips and late meetings. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom in a luxury hotel hallway. You either crumble completely, or you find something harder than grief to hold on to. And what I found was anger. Not the screaming, crying, dramatic kind. The cold kind. The kind that thinks clearly and moves strategically and refuses to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing you break. I couldn't believe that David thought he could just replace me like I was some outdated piece of furniture. He'd built his entire career using my emotional support, my connections from grad school, my unpaid labor managing his social calendar and networking events. And now that he'd climbed high enough, he was kicking away the ladder and pretending I'd never existed. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and opened the photos I'd taken throughout the night, dozens of them, shot discreetly from my position as invisible staff. David and Vanessa arriving together, his hand on her pregnant belly, the toast, the kiss, every angle of their public intimacy, time-stamped and geotagged. Then I opened my banking app and looked at our joint accounts, the ones he'd always insisted we keep for transparency. The recent transactions told their own story. Jewelry purchases I'd never received, hotel stays in cities I'd never visited, restaurant charges for 2 on nights he'd told me he was working late. The truth had been hiding in plain sight, and I'd been too trusting to look. I thought about walking back in there. I imagined the drama of it, throwing open those ballroom doors, still in my server's uniform, and announcing to 300 of Manhattan's elite that the woman they were toasting was a homewrecker and my husband was a cheating liar. I could picture Vanessa's face going pale, David scrambling for explanations, the shocked gasps and instant social media explosion. But that would be messy. That would be emotional. That would give them the narrative of the crazy wife who made a scene. And I was done giving David anything, including ammunition to paint me as unhinged. The revenge I wanted wasn't public embarrassment. It was total destruction, and that required precision. I stood up straighter, smoothed down my uniform, and made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to confront him tonight. I wasn't going to cry or beg or ask him to explain. I was going to go home, and I was going to systematically dismantle the life he thought he'd so cleverly built behind my back. See, David had made one critical mistake in his betrayal. He'd underestimated me. He saw a nonprofit worker who made 1/3 of his salary and assumed I had no power. But what he'd forgotten, or maybe never really knew, was who my family was. I'd kept my maiden name out of his world, kept it off the parts of our life that came with status and leverage, kept quiet about my trust fund, kept my father's law firm connections separate from our life because I wanted to be loved for me, not my money. But watching my husband toast his future with another woman while I stood there in a borrowed uniform, I realized that wanting to be loved for yourself only works when the other person is capable of real love. David loved status. He loved climbing. He loved winning. And if that's the game he wanted to play, I was about to show him what it felt like to lose everything. I walked out of that hotel with my fake badge and my server's uniform, but inside I was already planning. By this time tomorrow, David's perfect new life was going to come crashing down so hard he wouldn't know what hit him. And the best part? He'd have no one to blame but himself. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in our home office, the one David barely used anymore because he was always too busy, and made phone calls. First to my father's senior partner, a man who specialized in high-stakes divorces and had been waiting for years for me to finally admit I needed help. Then to a moving company that operated overnight for clients who needed discretion. Then to my cousin who managed my trust fund and had been quietly disapproving of David since the day we got engaged. By 3 a.m., and I had a team assembled. By 6 a.m., they were at my door. And by the time David's alarm would normally go off, my entire life, or at least the physical evidence of it, was being systematically removed from our penthouse. The movers worked like a military operation. Every piece of furniture I'd brought into the marriage, gone. Every wedding gift from my side of the family packed. Every piece of art I'd purchased with my own money, carefully wrapped and loaded. My clothes, my books, my grandmother's china that David had always hated. All of it disappeared into a truck headed for a storage facility in my name only. I stood in the middle of our bedroom watching strangers dismantle 10 years of marriage, and I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. The shocking thing wasn't that it hurt less than I expected. It was that it felt like finally exhaling after holding my breath for years. I'd been making myself smaller to fit into David's vision of our life, and now I was reclaiming every inch of space I'd given up. But I didn't stop at just my belongings. I also took items that were mine or from the marriage, purchased with marital funds, properly documented. My attorney had approved each item that left, what was mine, what was marital property, and what needed to be inventoried. The expensive watch from his parents that was given to both of us for our 5th anniversary. First edition books I'd bought him for anniversaries with my inscriptions inside. I wasn't being petty. I was being strategic. Every item I removed was something he'd have to explain, something that would make the house feel emptier, something that would make him understand that I wasn't just leaving. I was erasing myself from his convenient narrative. The karma of it was beautiful. He'd tried to erase me from his new life, so I was erasing myself from his old one, on my terms. By 10 a.m., and the house looked like a completely different place. Not empty, that would have been too obvious, but hollow, like something vital had been removed, and all that remained was the shell. I walked through each room one last time, my footsteps echoing in spaces that suddenly felt too big, too cold, too much like the mausoleum of a marriage I'd been trying to revive while my husband was already planning the funeral. In the kitchen where we'd had our first fight. In the living room where we'd celebrated his promotions. In the bedroom where I'd waited up for him on all those nights he claimed to be working late. The truth was written in every corner, now that I could see it clearly. I left the envelope on the dining room table, the massive mahogany one his mother had insisted we buy, the one that cost $15,000 and seated 12 people we never entertained because David was always too busy. Inside the envelope, divorce papers, already filed with the court that morning, thanks to my father's connections. A USB drive containing every photo from the gala, every bank statement showing his affair-related expenses, every text message I'd recovered from our shared iCloud account that he'd stupidly never removed me from, and a single-page letter, typed in professional, that said simply, "I know everything. My attorney will be in touch. Don't contact me. Don't come to my family's home. Sign the papers. No emotion. No accusations. Just facts and instructions." The dignity I was reclaiming started with refusing to beg for explanations I didn't need. I set up my laptop on the kitchen counter before I left, angling the camera to capture the dining room table and the envelope. I wanted to see his face when he found it. Call it petty. Call it revenge. But I needed to witness the exact moment David realized he'd lost control of the narrative. I synced the camera to my phone, locked the door behind me with a key I'd already had deactivated from the building's security system. My name was on the deed as co-owner, and my family knew the building administrator, making it simple to have his access temporarily suspended pending the divorce filings and property dispute, for safety and liability reasons, and walked out of that penthouse for the last time. As I got into the Uber that would take me to my father's estate in Connecticut, my phone buzzed with a notification. David was home early, and he was about to discover that his carefully constructed double life had just collapsed into a very public, very legal, very expensive nightmare. While David was still riding the high from the night before, phase 2 of my plan had already been set in motion. At exactly 5 a.m. that morning, an emergency board meeting had convened at his investment firm. My uncle, who sat on that board and had been quietly furious about David's treatment of me for years, had finally been given permission to act. The meeting wasn't about David's affair. That would have been messy and potentially sympathetic. It was about something far more damaging to a man who'd built his entire identity on being untouchable. A comprehensive audit of his expense accounts, client relationships, and corporate conduct over the past 18 months. The shocking part wasn't what they found. It was how easy it was to find it once someone actually looked. I watched through the camera feed as David walked into our penthouse, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice carrying that forced cheerfulness of someone trying to sound normal when everything is falling apart. He stopped mid-sentence. His eyes scanned the living room, and I could see the exact moment confusion registered on his face. The couch was gone. The coffee table was gone. The art on the walls, gone. He walked further inside, his forced laugh dying, whoever he was talking to forgotten, as he turned in a slow circle trying to understand what he was seeing. Then his eyes landed on the dining room table, on that single envelope sitting in the center like a tombstone. After reading the envelope, he didn't stay home. He ran to the office like a man trying to put out a fire with his bare hands, still believing he could control something, not knowing the board meeting had already happened. He opened it right there, standing in the middle of our hollowed-out home, and I watched his face cycle through emotions like a slot machine. Confusion turned to shock, turned to panic, turned to rage. He pulled out his phone and started calling me. I'd already blocked his number, but I could see him trying over and over, his face getting redder with each failed attempt. Then he did exactly what I knew he would. He called his lawyer. I could read his lips through the camera as he paced and gestured wildly, probably demanding to know how I could just take everything, how this was illegal, how he was going to fight this. What he didn't know yet, what he was about to discover, was that he'd already lost this fight the day he signed our prenuptial agreement. See, David had insisted on a prenup when we got engaged. His family money, old Wall Street money that he loved to casually mention at parties, required it, he'd said. Protection for both of us, he'd claimed. I'd been 26 and in love and stupidly trusting. I signed it with my own counsel in the room, but I never imagined I'd actually need it. But what David never bothered to read carefully, because he'd been too arrogant to imagine he'd ever be the one caught cheating, was the infidelity clause. It wasn't a romantic clause. It was negotiated by attorneys on both sides, with independent legal counsel, signed without pressure. David thought it protected him. It protected me. The one that said if either party committed adultery with documented proof, the betrayed spouse retained full ownership of all marital assets acquired during the marriage, plus a penalty equal to 50% of the guilty party's individual net worth. My phone rang, not David's blocked number, but his attorney's. I let it go to voicemail and listened to the increasingly frantic message. Mrs. Chen, this is Robert Morrison calling on behalf of your husband. We need to discuss these divorce filings immediately. There seems to be some confusion about asset division, and I'm sure we can work this out amicably without involving... I deleted it before he could finish. There was nothing to work out. The prenup was ironclad. My father's firm had made sure of that 10 years ago when they'd drawn it up, probably sensing something about David that my love-blind 26-year-old self couldn't see. The justice of it was poetic. David's own insistence on protecting his precious family money was now the mechanism destroying him. Through the camera, I watched David collapse into one of the few remaining chairs, his head in his hands. His lawyer must have just explained the prenup clause because his whole body seemed to deflate. The betrayal he'd inflicted on me with such casual cruelty was now being visited back on him with legal precision, and there was nothing he could do about it. The penthouse we'd bought together? Mine. The vacation home in the Hamptons he'd purchased as an investment? Mine. His Tesla, his boat, his country club membership, all purchased during our marriage with marital funds. All now mine. And the kicker? That 50% penalty meant he owed me approximately $4.3 million from his personal accounts and stock options. I could see him making more calls, probably to his parents, probably to Vanessa, definitely spiraling as he realized the scope of what he'd done. But here's what he still didn't understand, what he wouldn't figure out until much later. I didn't want his money. I had my own money. More than he'd ever made, actually. Sitting in trusts he knew nothing about. What I wanted was for him to feel what I'd felt standing in that ballroom watching him build a future with someone else. I wanted him to understand that actions have consequences, that you can't just discard people who loved you, that karma doesn't care how important you think you are. And based on the way he was currently curled up in that chair looking like his world had just ended. Mission accomplished. But I wasn't done yet. Not even close. See, David had gotten sloppy. When you're living a double life, funding a mistress's lifestyle while maintaining the appearance of a devoted husband, corners get cut. Corporate credit cards get used for personal expenses that are creatively labeled as client entertainment. Company resources get redirected. Policies get bent. Nothing egregious enough to trigger automatic flags, but everything problematic enough to violate the firm's strict code of conduct, once compiled into a single damning report. My uncle had made sure the right people saw that report at 5 a.m., before the markets opened, before David could spin any narrative. By the time David arrived at his corner office, his security credentials had already been deactivated. The beauty of corporate consequences is that they're cold and bureaucratic and utterly final. There's no passionate argument to be made, no emotional appeal that works. The board had the numbers. They had the policy violations. They had liability concerns and reputation risks, and a very clear path forward that didn't include David Chen, managing director. I wasn't there for the meeting, I didn't need to be, but my uncle called me afterward to relay what happened. They didn't even debate it, he told me, satisfaction clear in his voice. Once they saw the pattern, the vote was unanimous. Immediate termination, forfeiture of unvested stock options, 6-month non-compete clause. He's done in this industry. The karma felt almost biblical in its swiftness. But it wasn't just about firing him. The firm needed to protect itself from any potential blowback, which meant they went nuclear. By 9 a.m., a press release went out announcing David's departure to pursue other opportunities, with the standard corporate speak that everyone in finance knows means you were pushed, not jumped. His company email was deactivated. His clients were reassigned. His nameplate was removed from his office door. And most importantly, HR activated a full forensic audit of his accounts, with instructions to cooperate fully with any external investigations that might arise. They were essentially hanging him out to dry, making it clear that any wrongdoing was his alone, not the firm's. The humiliation of going from rising star to persona non grata in less than 4 hours would have been devastating to anyone. To David, whose entire self-worth was wrapped up in his title and status, it was annihilation. I got the text from my uncle at 10:47 a.m. Security just escorted him out. He tried to argue, threatened legal action, made quite a scene. They told him his personal belongings would be mailed to him. He left in a taxi. I pictured it. David, who'd pulled up to that gala last night in a company car with a mistress on his arm, now standing on a Manhattan sidewalk in his $1,000 suit with a cardboard box of desk photos, calling for a cab because his corporate Uber account had already been terminated. The same colleagues who'd toasted his future with Vanessa last night were probably watching from their windows, already gossiping, already distancing themselves from the scandal. In Manhattan's elite circles, failure is contagious, and David had just become radioactive. What made it even more perfect was the timing. He'd gone straight from the office humiliation to home, expecting to regroup, to plan his counterattack, maybe to call Vanessa and commiserate. Instead, he'd walked into an empty penthouse and divorce papers that stripped him of everything he owned. Both detonations, personal and professional, hitting within hours of each other, leaving him no safe place to land, no solid ground to stand on. I'd orchestrated it that way deliberately, because the truth about revenge isn't that it needs to be loud or dramatic. It needs to be complete. It needs to remove every escape route, every safety net, every illusion of control. And watching it unfold exactly as I'd planned, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Powerful. Not in spite of David's betrayal, but because of how I'd chosen to respond to it. The corporate audit was damaging, but what came next was devastating. My attorney, not just any attorney, but one of the best forensic divorce lawyers in New York, had spent the last 12 hours doing what she did best, following the money. And David, confident in his own cleverness, had left a trail wide enough to drive a truck through. Every hotel room in Miami where he'd taken Vanessa for business trips. Every piece of jewelry charged to corporate cards and labeled as client gifts. Every first-class flight, every spa weekend, every romantic dinner at restaurants that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Line by line, charge by charge, my attorney built a case that turned David's affair from a personal betrayal into something far more legally dangerous: corporate fraud and misappropriation of company funds. The firm's forensic accountants found it first during their internal audit, but my attorney made sure the right government agencies knew about it too. By 2 p.m., just hours after David had been escorted out of his office, formal notifications had been filed. By 2 p.m., and the reports were protocoled, and case numbers had been assigned to the SEC for potential securities violations, the IRS for documentation of unreported income and gifts, and the Manhattan District Attorney's Office received a comprehensive file detailing what appeared to be systematic fraud involving corporate resources used for personal affairs. I couldn't believe how quickly it snowballed. But then again, the government loves nothing more than a wealthy man who thinks he's above the rules. David had just become their new favorite target. The first sign that David's world was truly collapsing came when he tried to use his credit card, and it was declined. Then another card. Then another. My attorney had moved fast, filing emergency motions to freeze all marital assets pending the divorce settlement, citing flight risk and asset dissipation concerns. The judge, presented with evidence of David's affair spending and the corporate fraud investigation, had granted it immediately. Every joint account, frozen. Every credit card in both our names, canceled. His personal accounts were still accessible, but even those were now under scrutiny, as federal inquiries were initiated and his financial records became subject to subpoena and review. The shocking reality was hitting him in waves. He had no money, no job, no access to the life he'd been living. I got a call from my attorney around 4 p.m., and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. He just tried to withdraw cash from 3 different ATMs. All denied. Then he called the bank and apparently lost his mind when they told him about the asset freeze. They had to threaten to call security. She paused, and I could practically hear her smile. "Catherine, he's completely locked out. No credit cards, no bank access, no way to pay for anything. And here's the best part. The company just officially terminated his corporate housing allowance and his car lease. He's got about 72 hours before he needs to vacate the penthouse and turn in the Mercedes. The karma of it was almost too perfect. Just yesterday, he'd been toasting his future with another woman. Today, he couldn't even buy lunch. But the real devastation was still coming. My attorney had coordinated with the firm's legal team to ensure that when they turned over David's financial records to federal investigators, they were complete. Hotel stays that coincided with Vanessa's social media posts from the same cities. Jewelry purchases that matched pieces she'd been photographed wearing. Restaurant charges for 2 on nights David had told his bosses he was dining with clients. The pattern was undeniable, and it transformed what might have been a slap-on-the-wrist internal matter into potential criminal charges. Corporate fraud, tax evasion, false expense reporting. Each charge carrying potential jail time, not just fines. The truth about David's double life wasn't just embarrassing anymore. It was evidence. By evening, the legal noose had tightened to the point where David's options had narrowed to exactly one: cooperate fully, accept complete responsibility, and hope for leniency. But even that wouldn't save him from the personal destruction. His reputation was gone. His career was over. His freedom was uncertain. And the woman he'd betrayed me for? Well, she was about to find out that the wealthy, powerful, untouchable David Chen she'd fallen for was actually just a common criminal who'd used his employer's money to fund their relationship. I wondered how long it would take her to realize that the future he'd promised her, the one they'd toasted last night in front of Manhattan's elite, was built on lies and stolen money. The betrayal was coming full circle, and I had a front row seat to watch it destroy him. I didn't have to wait long to find out how Vanessa would react. My cousin, the one who managed my trust fund and had excellent connections in Manhattan's social circles, texted me around 7 p.m. with a screenshot that made me laugh out loud for the first time in days. It was from a private Instagram story, the kind only shared with close friends, and it showed Vanessa at dinner with a different man. Not just any man, a hedge fund manager my cousin recognized from charity circuits. The caption read, "New beginnings," with a champagne emoji. Less than 24 hours after publicly kissing my husband at a gala, less than 12 hours after his entire life imploded, and she'd already moved on. The shocking speed of it would have hurt if I'd cared about Vanessa's character, but honestly, it just confirmed everything I'd suspected about their relationship. My cousin sent another message. Friend who works at her building says David showed up an hour ago. Doorman wouldn't let him up. He caused a scene. I could picture it perfectly. David, desperate and panicking, probably thinking Vanessa would be his safe haven, his consolation prize, the woman who'd stand by him now that everything else had fallen apart. Instead, he'd been turned away like a stranger, because that's exactly what he was to her, a means to an end. She hadn't fallen in love with David Chen, the person. She'd fallen in love with David Chen, the managing director with the corner office, and the corporate card, and the connections to Manhattan's elite. Now that those things were gone, so was her interest. The truth about transactional relationships is that they evaporate the moment the transaction stops benefiting both parties. Vanessa was young, beautiful, and apparently pregnant with a child whose father had just become unemployed, legally embattled, and potentially heading to prison. She'd done the math. The same cold, calculating math she'd probably done when she'd started the affair in the first place, and decided that David's falling stock wasn't worth the investment. The karma of it was poetic. David had betrayed our 10-year marriage, thrown away a woman who'd loved him unconditionally, all for someone who'd loved him conditionally, and now that the conditions had changed, he was discovering exactly how shallow that love had been. My attorney called with an update that made the situation even more brutal. His lawyer just contacted me. David wants to talk to you. He's, quote, desperate to explain, and thinks you don't understand the full situation. I laughed. Actually laughed at the audacity. What did you tell him? She chuckled. I told him that my client understands the situation perfectly, has no interest in explanations, and that all communication must go through legal channels. He broke down crying on the phone, Catherine. Started begging, saying Vanessa won't return his calls, his parents won't help him. He has nowhere to go. I felt nothing. No sympathy, no satisfaction, just cold indifference. This was the bed he'd made. Now he could lie in it. Alone. But the real devastation came in a video my uncle sent me later that night. Apparently, someone had filmed David's confrontation with Vanessa's doorman, and it was circulating in private group chats among Manhattan's financial elite. In it, you could see David, still in his now wrinkled suit from the office disaster, pleading with the doorman, his voice getting louder and more desperate. Just call her. Tell her it's me. Tell her I need to talk to her. Please. The doorman, professional and unmoved, kept shaking his head. Sir, Ms. Whitmore left explicit instructions. You're not on the approved visitor list. I need you to leave the premises. The humiliation of being denied entry to his mistress's building, caught on camera, shared among the very people who'd toasted his future just last night. It was the kind of social death that Manhattan never forgets. What killed me was the comment thread under the video in one of the group chats. People who'd congratulated him 24 hours ago were now making jokes. Guess the upgrade didn't work out. From corner office to street corner in one day. Anyone know if he's hiring? I could use someone who's good at creative expense reporting. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, but also revealing. These people had never cared about David. They'd cared about his position, his usefulness, his access to deals and connections. Now that he was toxic, they were discarding him with the same casual indifference he'd shown me. The betrayal he was experiencing from Vanessa, from his colleagues, from his entire social circle. It was the same betrayal he'd inflicted on me, except I'd loved him. They never had, and somehow that made his current suffering feel less like revenge and more like justice finally arriving right on time. 3 days after everything imploded, I got the call I'd been waiting for. The building manager at our penthouse, my penthouse now, legally, informed me that David had refused to vacate despite multiple notices. He'd been sleeping on the floor since I'd taken all the furniture, ordering takeout he apparently couldn't afford based on the declined credit cards piling up at the front desk, and generally making the doorman uncomfortable with his increasingly erratic behavior. The management wanted to know if I'd like them to handle it, or if I preferred to take care of it personally. I smiled. I'd take care of it personally, because the final humiliation David needed wasn't to be kicked out by strangers. It was to be removed by me, on my terms, with witnesses who could ensure he understood exactly how completely he'd lost. I arrived at the penthouse at 10:00 a.m. with my attorney, a police escort I'd requested through my father's connections, and a locksmith ready to change the locks one final time. When the officer knocked and announced himself, there was a long pause before David opened the door. I couldn't believe how much he'd deteriorated in just 72 hours. Unshaven, wearing the same clothes from days ago, eyes red and hollow. He looked at me with something between desperation and rage, and I felt absolutely nothing. "Catherine, please," he started, his voice cracking. "We need to talk. This is insane. You can't just—" My attorney cut him off smoothly. "Mr. Chen, you're trespassing on my client's property. You have 20 minutes to gather your personal belongings and vacate, or you'll be arrested." The shocking reality of his situation hit him as he looked between me, the lawyer, and the uniformed officer. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a conversation. This was an eviction. "Where am I supposed to go?" he asked, and the pathetic desperation in his voice might have moved me a week ago. Now it just sounded like consequences. "That's not my concern," I said calmly. "You had multiple days' notice. You chose to ignore it. Now you have 20 minutes. He tried again, stepping toward me with hands outstretched like he was going to touch me, and the officer immediately moved between us. "Sir, step back. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." David's face crumpled, and I watched a grown man who'd once commanded boardrooms start to cry in his own doorway. He gathered what he could in the time allowed: some clothes, his laptop, a few personal items that didn't belong to me. Everything else, including the expensive watch his parents had given us and the cufflinks I'd bought him for our 5th anniversary, stayed. They were marital property, and according to the prenup, they were mine. When the 20 minutes were up, the locksmith was already changing the locks as David stood in the hallway with 2 garbage bags of belongings like some kind of tragic sitcom character. "Catherine," he tried one more time, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I made a mistake. Please." The truth was, I'd waited years to hear him apologize, but now that it was here, forced out by desperation rather than genuine remorse, it meant nothing. But I'm not cruel. Despite everything he'd done, despite the affair and the lies and the public humiliation, I wasn't going to let him starve on the street. Before I left, I handed him an envelope, not unlike the one I'd left on the dining room table 3 days ago, but much thinner. Inside was a prepaid debit card loaded with $5,000 and a simple note. "This is the last thing you'll ever receive from me. Use it wisely. Don't contact me again." $5,000. Enough to survive for a month or 2 if he was careful. Enough to prove to anyone watching that I'd been generous in victory, but nowhere near enough to rebuild the life he'd destroyed. The dignity I was maintaining wasn't for his benefit. It was for mine. I wanted to walk away knowing I'd won without becoming someone I'd be ashamed of. As I walked away from that penthouse for the final time, David still standing in the hallway, clutching his garbage bags and that envelope, I felt the last piece of my old life fall away. The police officer nodded at me respectfully. My attorney was already on her phone coordinating the next steps. And David? David was learning what every cheater eventually learns. That betrayal has a price, that karma keeps perfect records, and that the people you destroy on your way up are often the same people who ensure you have nothing to land on when you fall. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. The man I'd married was gone, if he'd ever really existed at all, and the man who remained was simply reaping exactly what he'd sown. And somehow that felt like the most honest thing our relationship had produced in years. I should have known David wouldn't go quietly. Men like him, men who build their entire identity on being smarter than everyone else, don't accept defeat gracefully. They lash out. They burn bridges. They make catastrophic decisions in desperate attempts to regain control. 2 weeks after the eviction, my attorney called with news that David had filed a countersuit, claiming I'd orchestrated a conspiracy to destroy him, that my family had used their influence to get him fired illegally, and that the prenup was invalid because he'd signed it under duress. I couldn't believe the audacity, but my attorney just laughed. He's filed it pro se, representing himself, because no lawyer in the city will touch this case. It's going to get thrown out, but it shows how desperate he is. Desperate and stupid, apparently. Because what came next proved that David had learned absolutely nothing. In his panic to salvage something from the wreckage of his life, David made a move that sealed his fate permanently. He contacted a journalist at the Financial Times, claiming he had evidence of corporate corruption at his former firm, and that he'd been fired for trying to expose it. He painted himself as a whistleblower, a victim of powerful families protecting their interests. The shocking part wasn't that he tried this Hail Mary. It was that he was dumb enough to think the firm wouldn't have anticipated it. See? When you fire someone for cause, and you know they might retaliate, you get ahead of the story. You prepare. You document. And you make absolutely certain that any accusations they make will only dig their hole deeper. The firm's response was swift and brutal. Within 24 hours of David's interview request being published, they released their own statement. Not defensive, but offensive. A comprehensive press release detailing the forensic audit findings, complete with redacted expense reports, time-stamped evidence of policy violations, and a statement that they were cooperating fully with federal investigators regarding potential criminal conduct by former employee David Chen. They didn't just deny his accusations, they buried him with facts. Suddenly, David's whistleblower narrative transformed into what it actually was. A desperate attempt by a fired executive to deflect from his own misconduct. The betrayal he'd tried to inflict on his former employer boomeranged back with devastating force. But David wasn't done making things worse for himself. Apparently emboldened by the journalist's initial interest, he did something that still makes my attorney shake her head in disbelief. He filed a complaint with the IRS, claiming that my family's businesses were engaged in tax fraud. It was a transparent attempt at revenge. If I'm going down, I'm taking them with me. Move that showed just how disconnected from reality he'd become. What David didn't know, what he couldn't have known because he'd never bothered to actually understand my family's business, was that we'd been audited 3 times in the last decade and had passed with flying colors every time. We had entire teams of accountants whose only job was ensuring perfect compliance. His accusation wasn't just baseless. It was provably false. And filing false reports to federal agencies? That's a crime. The karma of it was almost too perfect. In trying to hurt me and my family, David had handed prosecutors another charge to add to their growing case against him. The IRS investigation he'd hoped would destroy us instead became another line item in his own legal troubles. My uncle, who sat on multiple corporate boards and had extensive government connections, made a few calls. Within a week, David received notification that he was under investigation, not just for corporate fraud, but also for filing false federal complaints and attempting to obstruct justice. Every move he made to fight back, every desperate attempt to regain power, only proved what I'd known all along. David had never been as smart as he thought he was. He'd just been protected by privilege and luck. And now that both had run out, his true nature was revealed. The final nail in David's self-made coffin came when the Financial Times journalist he'd contacted published a follow-up piece. Not the exposé David had hoped for, but a cautionary tale about executives who abuse corporate resources and then cry foul when caught. The article quoted legal experts, cited the firm's documentation, and painted David as a textbook case of entitlement meeting consequences. My attorney sent me the link with a simple message. He tried to control the narrative and ended up writing his own obituary. I've never seen someone self-destruct this thoroughly. I read the article once, feeling a strange mix of vindication and sadness. Not sadness for David. He'd earned every word of that piece. But sadness that a man I'd once loved had revealed himself to be this small, this reckless, this willing to burn everything down rather than accept responsibility for his own choices. The truth was finally public, and it was uglier than even I had imagined. The call came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 weeks after I'd walked out of that gala in my server's uniform. My attorney's voice was calm, but satisfied. They arrested him this morning. Federal charges, wire fraud, tax evasion, filing false government reports. He's being arraigned this afternoon. I set down my coffee and stared out the window of my father's estate, watching the sun rise over the Connecticut hills. I couldn't believe it had come to this, except I absolutely could. Every choice David had made since I'd discovered his betrayal had led him here, step by inevitable step. The shocking thing wasn't that he was being arrested. It was that he'd accelerated his own downfall so spectacularly that even I hadn't anticipated how fast he'd fall. I didn't attend the arraignment. I didn't need to. My attorney went as my representative and sent me updates throughout the day. David's public defender, he couldn't afford private counsel anymore, had tried to argue for bail, but the prosecutor painted him as a flight risk, with nothing tying him to New York, now that his assets were frozen and his career was destroyed. The judge set bail at $500,000, an amount David had no way of posting. His parents had apparently declined to help after learning the full scope of his crimes and the scandal he'd brought to their family name. The betrayal David must have felt when his own parents turned their backs probably mirrored what I'd felt watching him kiss Vanessa at that gala. Karma really does come full circle. What made the whole situation more tragic, or more fitting, depending on your perspective, was who showed up to watch the arraignment. My attorney spotted her in the back of the courtroom. Vanessa, visibly pregnant now, sitting alone with designer sunglasses covering half her face. She didn't approach David, didn't try to speak to him, just watched as the man who'd promised her a future was led away in handcuffs, her expression unreadable behind those glasses. My attorney said Vanessa left before the proceedings ended, disappearing into a car service that suggested she'd already found her next benefactor. The truth about their relationship, that it had always been transactional, always been about what he could provide, was written in her absence from his life now that he had nothing left to give. I found myself thinking about Vanessa's baby as I read the court documents that evening. That child would grow up knowing their father was a convicted felon, that their parents' relationship began with infidelity and ended with abandonment. David would miss the birth from prison. He'd miss everything, actually, if the prosecutor's recommended sentence of 5 to 7 years held up. The justice system was delivering a punishment I never could have orchestrated myself, proving that sometimes the best revenge really is just letting people face the natural consequences of their actions. I'd simply documented the truth and protected myself legally. Everything else, the corporate downfall, the criminal charges, the social exile, that was all him. My attorney asked if I wanted to submit a victim impact statement before sentencing. I thought about it for a long time. I could have written about the emotional devastation of discovering the affair, the humiliation of being erased from his life, the betrayal of 10 years of marriage, but in the end, I declined. David's crimes against me were personal, but his crimes against the company, against federal law, against basic honesty, those spoke for themselves. Adding my voice to the chorus of his victims felt unnecessary. The dignity I'd maintained throughout this entire nightmare meant walking away clean, not dragging myself back into his mess for a final word. He was going to prison. His reputation was destroyed. His future was ashes. What more could I possibly say? The day of his sentencing, I was in Paris for work. My attorney texted me the outcome. 6 years in federal prison, $2.3 million in fines and restitution, permanent prohibition from working in finance. I read it while sitting in a cafe in the Marais, drinking wine and reviewing contracts for my new position. I'd taken over leadership of my family's European operations, a role I'd always been qualified for, but had never pursued because I'd been too busy supporting David's career. I hadn't risen from nothing. I'd just stopped hiding. I closed my laptop, turned off my phone, and let myself feel the finality of it. It was over. The man who'd betrayed me, who'd tried to erase me, who'd built a future on lies and stolen money, he was gone, not just from my life, but from the world he'd valued so much. And I was free. Finally, completely, gloriously free to build whatever came next. The revenge had been perfect not because I'd destroyed him, but because I'd survived him. And that, I was learning, was the sweetest victory of all. 5 years later, I stood on a stage in Geneva, accepting an award for excellence in international business leadership, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd thought about David. Not in anger, not in satisfaction, not even in passing curiosity about where he was or what he was doing. He'd been released early 8 months earlier, I'd heard through the grapevine, and had moved somewhere quiet to rebuild whatever kind of life was possible for a convicted felon. But that information had landed in my consciousness and disappeared just as quickly, like news about a stranger I'd never met. The truth was, the woman who'd loved him, who'd believed in him, who'd sacrificed for him, she didn't exist anymore. I'd become someone entirely new, someone stronger, and David Chen was just a chapter in my origin story. I'd taken back my family name, Catherine Morrison, not Chen, erasing even that final connection to a marriage that felt like it had happened to someone else. The business I now ran had tripled in value under my leadership. I'd opened offices in Singapore and Dubai, negotiated deals that made headlines, and built a reputation based entirely on my own merit, not on who I was married to or who my father was. The self-worth I'd lost somewhere in those years of making myself smaller, of supporting David's ambitions at the expense of my own, I'd found it again. No, that's not quite right. I'd built something better than what I'd lost. I'd built dignity that no one could take from me, because it wasn't dependent on anyone else's validation. The award ceremony ended with a reception where I was introduced to dozens of people, including a documentary filmmaker named James, who asked if I'd ever consider sharing my story. What story? I asked, genuinely curious what he meant. Your rise in the business world. From nonprofit work to running a billion-dollar international operation in less than 5 years. It's remarkable. I smiled, thinking about everything he didn't know, everything that had happened in between. The gala, the disguise, the systematic dismantling of a life built on lies. Some stories are better left private, I told him. But later that night, I wondered if that was true, if my story might help someone else who was standing where I'd stood 5 years ago, invisible in a room full of people, betrayed by someone they trusted, wondering if they'd ever feel powerful again. I'd remarried 2 years after the divorce was finalized. Michael was everything David wasn't. Honest, supportive, genuinely interested in my success, rather than threatened by it. He was a human rights attorney who worked for the UN, and he'd known about my past before our first date, because I'd insisted on complete transparency. I need you to know I don't trust easily, I'd told him over coffee in Rome where we'd met at a conference. I need you to know I've been burned, and I won't give anyone the power to do that to me again. He'd looked at me with those steady brown eyes and said, "Good. Trust should be earned, not assumed." And I planned to earn it every single day. He'd kept that promise. 3 years of marriage, 1 beautiful daughter named Sophia, and not a single moment where I'd questioned his loyalty or honesty. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in a window or a mirror and barely recognize the woman looking back. She carried herself differently than the young nonprofit worker who'd fallen in love with ambition disguised as love. She wore her power comfortably, unapologetically. She'd learned that the best revenge isn't destruction. It's elevation. It's building something so magnificent that the person who tried to diminish you becomes irrelevant by comparison. David had wanted to erase me from his narrative, to trade up to someone who fit better in his world. Instead, I'd built a world where he wouldn't even qualify for entry level. The karma wasn't that he'd gone to prison, though that certainly happened. The karma was that I'd become everything I was always capable of being, and he'd never matter enough to witness it. On the flight home from Geneva, I opened my laptop to check emails and found one from Vanessa. My hand hovered over the delete button, but curiosity won. The message was short. I heard about your award. Congratulations. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry for my part in what happened. I was young and stupid and thought I was in love. I have a 4-year-old son who asks about his father sometimes, and I don't know what to tell him except the truth, that his father made terrible choices and hurt good people. I hope you've found happiness. I read it twice, then closed the laptop without responding. She'd found her consequences too, apparently. A child growing up without a father, questions with no good answers, the knowledge that she'd destroyed a marriage for a man who'd been nothing but smoke and mirrors. But her apology wasn't mine to accept or reject. It was just noise from a past I'd already moved beyond. I had a daughter waiting for me at home, a husband who loved me, a career I'd built with my own hands, and a future so bright, it made everything behind me look like shadows. And honestly, that was the only revenge I'd ever really needed, to live so well that betrayal became nothing more than the prologue to my greatest chapter. So here's what I want to know. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew, deep down knew, that something was wrong, but everyone around you was acting like everything was fine? Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Like your worth was determined by how useful you were to someone else? Drop your stories in the comments below, because I guarantee you're not alone. And here's the real question that keeps me thinking. When does loyalty to someone else become betrayal of yourself? At what point do you stop making yourself smaller to fit into someone else's vision and start reclaiming your own power? Tell me, would you have confronted him at the gala? Or would you have done what I did and played the long game? What's the craziest thing you've discovered about someone you trusted completely? I read every single comment, and trust me, knowing there are others out there who've walked through fire and come out stronger makes all the difference. If you've got someone in your life who makes you feel less than, who takes your dignity for granted, who thinks your boundaries are suggestions, share this video with them. Or better yet, share it with yourself as a reminder that you deserve better. You deserve honesty, respect, and a life built on truth, not lies. And if you want more stories about standing up to betrayal, reclaiming your self-worth, and watching karma deliver justice in the most satisfying ways possible, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because I've got plenty more where this came from, and something tells me you need to hear them just as much as I needed to live them. Remember, the best revenge isn't destruction. It's elevation. It's building a life so magnificent that the person who tried to diminish you becomes irrelevant by comparison. Your worth isn't negotiable. Your dignity isn't optional. And you are not required to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. Never forget that.